Herb appointed a fellow, his name was Dick Farson, to be the dean of the design school. At that point in time, there was a lot of shift in terms of emphasis about what was design and architecture all about. And Farson was a leading advocate of a kind of philosophy of empowering everyone, the man in the street, with design sensibilities. And even he'd written a famous book on children's liberation. Mm-hmm. So Richard, and he was also a very active member of a thing called the Aspen Design Conference at that time. Aspen Design Conference being a sort of major gathering in Aspen, Colorado for various luminaries in the design world. Mm-hmm. So Richard was appointed to this thing. He was a resident of Southern California and incredibly intelligent and very wide-ranging kind of interests. But he was not a designer per se. And that was a pretty radical thing to do with the school in the very first place, to make its dean a person who didn't come from the design field, but actually came from a kind of radical fringe of the design fields. People that he was associated with over that period of time were a guy whose name was Victor Papinek. Did you come across Victor Papinek?
Yeah, design for the real world.
Yeah, exactly. How do you make a generator out of an orange can? All that kind of stuff. But in the first iteration, I guess Richard and Herb Blau put their heads together and came up with a kind of dual co-chairs of the design field. It probably came to me because I'd made quite a lot of noise in New York City with a lot of avant-garde proposals, which were widely published. Really interesting stuff, but like way out there. And the other guy that came to was Peter Pearce. And Peter had been working for the Charles Eames office out here and was a acolyte of Bucky Fuller. Very, very much a kind of Buckminster Fuller follower and believer. So this is a kind of unholy trio. I think any reasonable person would say, whoa, this is like pretty far out, because we've got this, psychologist as the dean, we've got this, Bucky Fuller, whole earth person, and we've got Hodgetts, who's a kind of crazy, And so the three of us put together then a faculty, which was, at the time, I think, a really fairly remarkable faculty. Peter found a photographer, I'm not sure his name, Roger or somebody?
Is it Ben Lipson?
No, Ben was a friend of mine. Roger was another photographer. Roger was a kind of more corporate product photographer. Mm-hmm. Very, very, really good product photographer, setups, lighting, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And Ben Lipson was a former actor and radical political guy who was modeling himself on Danny Lyons. Does that ring a bell? Mm-hmm. Yes. Danny Lyons, the motorcycle guy. Okay, so Ben was more into a kind of reportage of lifestyles and radical lifestyles and social movements. Mm-hmm. So those were the two guys who were the photography guys. Mm-hmm. So once again, there was this pretty incredible duality, because Ben was out there photographing transvestites and all this kind of stuff, and that was in 1970. Mm-hmm.
In forming this program, it seems like it was a radical shift in the way that design was being conceived inside of an institute. And right. So what kind of...
Absolutely no relationship to anything you've ever experienced. None. Ground up, push the boundaries. So, well, you have to put it in a social context.
Yeah.
You know, the social context is that, for the most part, modernism was being challenged. The big social uproars of the day had to do with civil rights, major turmoil in terms of civil rights, major turmoil in terms of, remember, this was just 5 years after the Berkeley free speech movements.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a time when throw everything out but the bathwater. So there was a real feeling of urgency that one needed to find a different way. Now, I think that was all going on unbeknownst to the Disney family and the Disney governorship. I don't think they had their ear to the ground about that stuff, mm-hmm. either in music or design or art, mm-hmm. any of those elements. But, the art, Judy Chicago came out of the art program, was hired into the art program. Mm-hmm. And Judy is probably the most radical feminist artist, probably in the history of artists. Mm-hmm. On the design school end, I knew the Ant Farm guys from years before, and they had a residency there. Ant Farm was a radical design collective who built a media van and drove across the United States with an inflatable and a gaggle of beautiful young women. So there was a tinge throughout the school of being engaged with social change, being engaged with technological change, but very kind of seat of the pants, whole earth catalog type stuff. So,
what was the definition of ecological design, and how is that?
It was without any aesthetic pretension at all. Like, in other words, aesthetics were hardware store, do-it-yourself, enabling people in the general population to do it. So, it's, well, how do you build a solar collector with garden hose? How do you do an earth ram house? All kinds of stuff which never ever caught on, but which all of the people at the school believed really deeply in. Mm-hmm. So there was, I think much to the dismay of the Disneys, we didn't give it at all a corporate or an entertainment kind of dimension whatsoever. It was probably, I don't think any of us understood it, but really, really, really hard for anybody to swallow in a broader social sense.
Seems to be this idea of non-hierarchical.
Yeah, very non-hierarchical.
Learning that was stressed in the program. And sort of related to this is this idea of the users themselves solving the problem. Were there some challenges in implementing and institutionalizing this idea?
Oh, sure, yeah. And that was, let's say, Richard Farson was the real leader of that. And he was a very good facilitator. If you have a bunch of people around and you have charts and you think of people's desires and you kind of, use those as a kind of map of what a design ought to accomplish. And you would try to set aside preconceptions and motives. So, for instance, in line with this children's liberation, for instance, we had a project to make a house something where there was not, where children were fully enabled to do everything that adults could do. So it had to do with, okay, putting the light switches down lower. It had to do with realizing that a microwave oven is perfectly safe. Designing refrigerators that were kid-friendly. Erasing the hierarchy between adults and children in the household. Erasing notions of sexual privacy. Becoming much more tribal, in a sense. Conceiving of a house without all of the, well, for instance, another part of that was the typical household in the, again, this is before your time, but like on a TV sitcom, et cetera, was always a conventional 3-bedroom house, couple of bedrooms upstairs, living room downstairs, front door, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we felt that needed to be challenged. What would be a liberated household? Well, it's one where the children can come and go as they please. They have their own doors to the exterior, rather than having to go out through the front door. Throw out all of the bourgeois conventions, start from ground zero, try to think what will make a better society, and move on from there. So those were the kinds of projects that we gave as studio projects. And, it was I would say that was a tall order for an awful lot of the students came from kind of upper crust show business families. They were pretty well, pretty well coddled. Many of the students, especially the design program, they were children of some privilege. And so they were driving their Mercedes and so forth and so on up to campus, and then we were, we were trying to fill their minds with all this radical stuff. So, there was quite a tension there, I would say, from some quarters. It was like, what's happening here? This isn't what we expected, et cetera, et cetera.
You wrote an article in Artforum in 1973 about the teaching machine.
The design faculty and most of the rest of the faculty, we were really, really unhappy with the architectural embodiment of this program. The really, really fruitful year, it might have been 2 years, of the school were when we were at a place called Villa Cabrini, which was an old nunnery. And it had kind of a classical European network of cloisters and courtyards. And in that configuration, the courtyard became like a mixing chamber. And you would have, somebody working away on the drums while somebody else was building some sculpture, while somebody else was doing some dance rehearsal, while somebody else was, sitting in the corner trying to draw something. So the cross section and the kind of mixing chamber of those courtyards was incredibly invigorating. I mean, just incredible. And if you can imagine Ravi Shankar sitting in a corner and plucking away at something, I mean, it's just fucking beyond belief. The school, which Thornton Ladd designed, there's your papers.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Was the antithesis of that, as you know. Thornton had sold the the trustees on this idea of what he called a community of the arts. That was the agenda. And, you know, his spokes, each department having a spoke coming out from the central, it's not a courtyard, but the central space, was diagrammatically, it said, oh, it's all one community, everybody's all part of the same thing, and all feeds into that. Well, of course, the design faculty knew that wasn't the case, that was not going to act that way. It was going to isolate these various pods out there, and was extremely destructive to what we saw as the culture of the school. And you know, it was challenged, but to no avail. I mean, the trustees, and Ladd, as you know, probably was a Disney son-in-law. So that wasn't going to change. And so the building was built. And then, you know, the piece that I wrote for Artforum was a kind of caustic remembrance of the building, or I don't recall it very well at this point, but it was certainly not it wasn't full of applause and good vibes. You know, the interesting thing in retrospect is that the student body has actually, from the beginning, had such an incredible vitality and energy that I would say, in spite of the building, the Calarts culture is just phenomenal. I do think it's in spite of the building, but you could also say, well, Jesus, if they'd had a building that was really right for them, God only knows what would have happened.
Right.
As it was, there were the nude swimming in the swimming pool controversies, which you're aware of, all of which Richard Farson, who was in a certain way the kind of lifestyle guru, not an intellectual, but someone very interested in the liberal lifestyle, was basically all for, encouraged that. If people were smoking weed, he had no problem with that. A typical big controversy in the design school was whether we could get a color Xerox machine, which at that time was a really clumsy, not a sophisticated machine at all, but it did print in color. And so the trustees and the administration were very negative about investing the $10,000 in a Xerox machine, because they were convinced the students would use it to counterfeit money. And so we were prevented from getting a color Xerox machine for the design school because the administration was afraid the students would counterfeit money with it. So that's a typical, here we are trying to enable the students to do more, and the administration, with a totally different value set, is worried about the downside. And that polarity is exactly, that typifies the polarity that was there, which, again, I think people of your generation have a really hard time imagining an administrative or political context in which that would become a hot button issue. Like, what? You want a color Xerox machine? Well, sure. It's totally different, totally antagonistic, kind of a DMZ between what was happening in terms of real social change, what was happening in terms of real creativity, et cetera, and the preconception that administrative bodies had. It was literally unbridgeable. It was like profound, very, very, very profound. I mean, it's extremely interesting looking back now and seeing that there was a desire to employ every single sort of aspect of developing technology and stuff towards enabling individual creativity. And so, the speculation was about things like personal computing, things like all of this, which were all inspiring and which, like, the Artforum guys, one of their big deals was that Sony had just come out with a portable video camera. And it had a tape recorder in a satchel about this big, video tape recorder and battery pack, and then a bunch of umbilicals, and then a TV camera. Well, Artforum, and I think eventually the school got a couple because of Artforum. But that idea of not having a corporate broadcast base and running around with the video cameras filming God only knows what, parties, animals, didn't matter, and making, video documentaries was, I'm sure, maybe the only school in the world which had even considered that kind of thing. Namjoon Paik, who's a very famous video artist, was on the faculty. And well, not famous, he was going to become a famous video artist, but he wasn't at that time. So all that stuff was like bubbling up, and it felt like it was all going to happen in the next 10 years.
So why did the design school fold after?
Oh, okay, well, this is a goodie. I think it had to do with two things. One was the radical leadership of Herb Blau, which had reached a head a couple of years into the program. And the trustees were becoming very, very nervous about the school as a whole. And asked for his resignation. And the handwriting seemed to be on the wall that the programs of the school as a whole, with the dismissal of Herb and I don't know that they asked for Richard Farson's resignation. I don't think they did. No, not quite caught up on that, but Herb Blau for sure. And the design school had been, I would say, a little bit of a, maybe a white elephant, in that the Victor Papanek had come aboard, which radicalized it beyond where I was, frankly. And I think the administration was really trying to tamp things down. And so when Herb was fired, there were a number of us who felt spiritual sympathy with that. And so I resigned in sympathy with Herb. Peter Pearce, I think, stayed on. I'm not sure, but I think Peter stayed on with Victor Papanek. Keith Goddard, who was the graphic design head, and Sheila de Bretteville. Sheila now is, as you may or may not know, she's the dean of graphic arts at Yale. So she's she was a prominent person then. She is now, she was a radical feminist. She resigned with Herb's departure. She's a very political person. So politics had a lot to do with, and then Ben Lifson got fired. You know about that
from
event.
The trustees meeting?
Yeah. I mean, I was there. He did. Got up on top of the table and paraded around without a stitch. Because it was getting insane. I mean, people were making nude bathing a defining aspect of what was happening at the school.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, for the most part, maybe unanimously, the faculty didn't give a shit. It was like, yeah, that's not what we're here for. If the students want to do that, that's okay. We're here for this. Students are liberated.
Mm-hmm.
They can do what they please. We were very, very, very unified in the idea that the parietal kind of burden which is put upon a normal school was just not part of the culture. And so that was a huge firestorm. It was just like a nuclear bomb. And the design school went down with that.
Mm-hmm.
The graphics program survived, and I think that's, in a larger sense, I think it's because graphics are in a way a kind of less threatening art form, more subservient kind of art form.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably also why Sheila left. Sheila was trying to start a magazine during her tenure there, and she's really strict. I mean, so Sheila is like, take no prisoners. So she considered any typeface other than Helvetica to be somehow compromising, either decorative or in some way or other not pure.
Mm-hmm.
So Helvetica was the accepted typeface, and she considered any illustrative medium other than black and white photography to be also similarly compromised. So her idea for a magazine was the magazine have no hand illustrations, only black and white photography at a high resolution in Helvetica typefaces. So, it was like a manifesto kind of idea, totally uncompromised, but, not movie posters. Movie posters? Are you serious? No. So so she had reached a point where she felt that the program was going to be really compromised, and also with the other stuff where she quit. It was fiery. So the radical fringe of the artist faculty left.
And this was around 1975?
A little earlier than that, I think, 73, maybe. I don't know, you'd have to check. 73 makes more sense to me, but somewhere in there. But there was basically a house cleaning